My name is Henrietta Moore. I'm the director of the IGP, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Karel Williams from the University of Manchester, who's actually giving the inaugural seminar for this wonderful new institute. And we're very grateful to him coming all the way down from Manchester. Now, Professor Williams is Professor of Accounting and Political Economy at the Manchester Business School. His theoretical interests are extremely broad and range widely, from poverty in manufacturing to shareholder value to financialisation, corporate governance and austerity. But if anyone in the United Kingdom who might know how to control the economy and possibly change it, then it's definitely Professor Williams. So today he's going to talk to us about the foundational economy and the challenge for prosperity. So please welcome Professor Williams.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about the foundational economy. And I think my premise is that we have in social science piled up enough critiques to reach to the moon. And it would help to have a bit more language and vision. And I doubt very much whether it's possible anymore to come up with one language and vision which everybody will dutifully sign up to. But this is a vision which has been put together by a group of people, an interdisciplinary group of people. It includes a political scientist, it includes John Law from actor network theory, which is an attempt to understand, above all, where we are in the UK now, and to an extent, broader questions as well. So I'm going to talk about a series of things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the 30-year experiment since 1979, the Thatcher-Blair years, which frames the world in which we live in. Then I'm going to shift to something which is rather more esoteric. I'm going to talk about mundane activities like supermarkets, railway operation, and things of that sort, and argue that many of these mundane activities are in fact being mismanaged in the UK. And then, at this point, I'm going to pull the rabbit out of the hat, and I'm going to start talking about the foundational economy as an object. What happens if you put the different mundane activities together? And finally, I'm going to talk about thinking about policy in different ways in terms of reorganizing sectors, not redistributing income. And I think what this is about, in a sense, is seeing different things in the economy and seeing different possibilities of prosperity. And it's not a kind of paradigm shift, but it is a Gestalt flip. And there's Ludwig Wittgenstein's favorite Gestalt figure. And if you look at the left, you see the duck's beak. And if you look at the right, you see the rabbit's mouth. What I'm going to do is simply say, let's look at the economy in a slightly different way. And let's see something which hasn't been put together, configured in people's minds before. So first of all, the familiar stuff, the 30-year experiment since 1979. British history is framed by two experiments: the post-war settlement, which floated on the post-war boom and sank with it in the 1970s, and the post-79 experiment by Thatcher-Blair, which flexibilized labor markets, privatized the utilities, and all the rest of that kind of stuff which has created our world. And I suppose it is now generally accepted that this didn't work to cure British relative decline, This is a country which has been self-consciously in relative decline, at least since the Edwardian years and the scandal about national efficiency. And we've recurrently adopted fixes. And this is simply the latest one, which didn't work. And my colleague Mick Moran, who's a political scientist, sums up how it hasn't worked in terms of the four deficits. It hasn't made us more competitive against the Germans in manufacturing, which has always been the 20th century problem. It hasn't delivered sustainability. The post-war settlement delivered lots of public goods, but now the privatized utilities are reluctant to invest. It's not accountable, though it was legitimized in terms of a language of accountability. We have out-of-control corporate elites, opaque franchises. And, you know, this also is familiarly not a new age of competence, but a continuation of earlier fiascos. PPP, rail franchising, financial regulation, all of it, one damn fiasco after the next. This is really what has filled the newspapers for the last 5 or 6 years. And it's a peculiarly British kind of result, except that it isn't, because, of course, what was adopted after '79 is a kind of, subsequently, a generic recipe for structural reform, relevant to Greece, Zimbabwe, Matteo Renzi's Italy. Today in the FT, there's absolutely classic piece recommending Renzi to finally summon up his courage and do the kind of Thatcher Blair thing in Italy, and, you know, do his current reforms of the labor market go far enough? And it's very interesting in this context if you see the 30-year experiment as a particular case of structural reform. Because, of course, in Britain and also in America now, you have 30 years of experience. It's had its chance. And I think I would draw your attention to the fact that although it always is offered as a recipe for prosperity, and prosperity defined as jobs and growth, what it has actually delivered is, of course, unsustainability and inequality. And I'll take you through 3 separate aspects of that unsustainability and inequality. First, the jobs came from public expenditure on health, education, and welfare. If you look at the second line there, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, 1979 to 2010, the British added 4.3 million jobs, of which just 1.4 million, 33%, were private. 2/3 of them were publicly taxpayer-funded in health, welfare, and education. Increasingly, these were actually in private employers like nursery schools who are actually indirectly being supported by state funding. But the fact of the matter is that 2/3 of the jobs came from the public sector, not the flexibilized private labor market. The second point is that if the jobs came from the public sector, the demand came from housing equity withdrawal, which is ordinary middle-class people remortgaging their houses against rising capital values and applying the proceeds to children's education, buying Volkswagen Golfs, new kitchens, and other worthy objects of life. This actually looks at housing equity withdrawal measured by the Standard Bank of England series against nominal GDP growth. So on the one hand, you've got what people are taking out by remortgaging, and on the other, you have the cash value of GDP growth. And what you see under both Thatcher and Blair is that housing equity withdrawal was actually fractionally larger than GDP growth. It didn't all go on GDP growth, but this is the driver of the economy. Very different from the enterprise economy that we were promised, and of course, completely unsustainable. And the third one is who gets the growth, who gets the GDP. And this simply looks at working households non-retired households, and it looks at their share of original income, what comes out of employment. And what you see, of course, is that the top 20% of households, which of course includes a lot of fairly ordinary people like Henrietta and myself, actually have done very nicely out of the last 30-year experiment, whereas the bottom 20% of households got absolutely nothing at all, which, if you think about it, of course, is the logic of flexibilized labor markets, because the guys at the bottom get stuffed. And I think this is actually quite an interesting way of looking at things, the jobs from public expenditure, the consumption from housing equity withdrawal, the income gains to the top 20%, because it allows you to answer that examination question on what is neoliberalism. And the answer is that neoliberalism is, of course, not the program, but it's the gap between the promise of prosperity and the outcome of unsustainability. And it also suggests, doesn't prove, but it also suggests that structural reform may actually undermine the possibility of any kind of stable macroeconomic policy. That's one of the things that policymakers wouldn't really like to consider, whether you've created a monster where no setting of the macro policy levers would produce sustainable prosperity. Now, this is I think, a focused account, but it's over fairly familiar ground. If you actually read much political economy, from Andrew Gamble to Wolfgang Streeck, you'll see variants on this with different accents. Wolfgang puts the emphasis on debt, etc., etc., etc. All of it is fairly well agreed. We now turn to a rather different kind of set of mundane sectors and activities, where I have to admit that, much of life is bricolage. We got into this simply because a couple of people commissioned us to work on mundane activities. And we'd also been working on financial reform. And I'd come to the conclusion that that was the prerogative of a very small inner circle of policymakers, so that whatever you said or did would have no impact at all. So entirely by accident, I don't have many friends who are successful in life, but a friend of mine was actually chief executive of what was then Britain's largest meat processor. And he said, why don't you have a look at meat supply in the UK? And another set of friends in the TUC said, why don't you have a look at railways? And since then, we've written a book, which I can show you the cover of. And this, of course, is the best £10 that you will ever spend. The end of the experiment, which adds 3 more cases about telecoms, dairy, and retail banking. And this was looking at the 30-year experiment in a slightly different kind of way. Because when we looked at it, all these sectors had been subject to a kind of generic competition in markets experiment. Regardless of what the activity was, competition in markets was the answer. And what one quickly found was that there were more gaps here between promise and outcome. The whole promise of competition in markets on a sectoral basis would be that it would drive benefits for consumers and efficiency at the producer level. But that what was actually happening was what we called egregious behavior. And this covered things like the supermarkets being nasty to the sausage manufacturers, who were then nasty to the pig farmers, so that, for example, the pig herd had declined by half in the UK, and we were actually buying in pigs from and bacon from Denmark and Holland, where wages were actually higher, and lots of it just didn't make sense. And when we looked at train operators, we found people like Richard Branson, who in effect had invested absolutely nothing in the West Coast Main Line, the line that runs up through Manchester and Preston, had benefited from 10 billion of public funding applied to rebuilding the line and the signalling, and had managed to take out £500 million in dividends from the operation of Virgin Trains. This really hadn't worked out. We began to think about why it hadn't worked out, what the drivers of this kind of mismanagement were. And it seemed to me that one could describe it as a preoccupation with point value, a kind of market trader mentality, whereby everybody was trying to improve their own results in their own revenue account. And you could apply this to shareholder value firms, or you can now apply it to local council adult social care departments, screwing down the price they pay for an old person's bed or whatever, you know, kind of regardless of the consequences further down the chain, which is, of course, how market traders have behaved through the whole of history. But it's not how large corporates and public organizations traditionally behaved, because traditionally they accepted some degree of reciprocity and mutual codependence. And so we've acquired a large file of cases where people extract point value at the expense of somebody else in the chain. In supermarkets, above all, it's the processor. The farmers squeal and barricade the processing plants and appear on the news. The processing companies are not in a position to actually protest, or they will be punished by the withdrawal of contracts. The processor share of a pint of milk fell from 35 to 19% in the decade after 2002, and look to see how cheap milk is being sold in your local Asda or Tesco. That's power against the suppliers. Retail banks, power against the customers. There's not a supply chain there. So what you do is you missell to customers again and again and again. They did it on endowment mortgages, they did it on personal pensions, they did it on payment protection insurance, they did it on interest rate swaps for small business. You sell useless products to cover your branch costs. The branches on the high street are basically sales outlets, and you treat the fines as a cost of business. Outsourcing leads to value extraction by predatory operators like Mr. Branson on the West Coast Line, and privatized utility operators will not cross-subsidize and will not invest. So you have EDF, which is prepared to build a nuclear power station at Hinkley Point, provided the price of electricity is guaranteed for 30 years. Or you have BT in broadband and telecoms, and I would say do read the case study on broadband and telecoms, which is essentially refusing to engage in the old-style cross-subsidy that state utilities did. When I was a kid and they were electrifying farms in South Wales, you didn't pay the full cost of what it cost to bring the electricity on the poles across the fields. You paid a standard connection charge, which was cross-subsidized from the urban consumer for social reasons, because we wished to be an electrified society. But now BT will only build rural broadband if that's dealt with in a separate account and if it's suitably incentivized by the state, and on condition that it doesn't open its books to the government to show how much money it's making out of rural broadband. If you're a supplier to Tesco or Asda, you have to open your books so that they can see how much money you're making. All of this pervasive mismanagement of mundane activities, and the common connecting thread is point value. And one then has to think, this takes us into a slightly different area, because I don't think anybody has worked quite as remorselessly on mundane activities as we have in the last few years. There's also a sense of déjà vu that one's been here before. And as the cases piled up, we suddenly realized that this was really Tim Mitchell and James C. Scott all over again. Authoritarian state planning, the application of generic formulae regardless of activity or local circumstances leads to debacle. You know, the great theme of Scott's book, the great theme of that, you know, marvelous opening chapter in Tim Mitchell's Rule of Experts. And it was very funny also because the guys who were doing this kind of authoritarian state planning of competition in markets had completely closed minds, and whenever failures were drawn to their attention, they attributed it to market failure. And the problem was, in a Maoist kind of way, the revolution fails because it's incomplete. So that, you know, and banking was the classic one. The solution to banking is more competition, new entrants, better informed customers. We had a competition authority inquiry announced last week, which was hugely applauded by everybody because it fitted the framework. That the task of the competition authority is to actually complete the revolution. That if we drive further, it will actually produce the result. And indeed, the state and market regulators, you can carry on with this stuff, are in Leninist terms, of course, useful idiots. Because generally speaking, the competition authority will immediately strike down collusive behavior, price fixing between different supermarkets or different retail banking chains. But if they all choose to adopt similar business models, and they all choose to adopt business practices like, for example, confusion marketing, then the competition authority will not protest at all. Let me explain confusion marketing. Confusion marketing is proliferating umpteen offers. The classic example would be energy tariffs of such a complicated kind that the consumer cannot make value for money comparisons. This applies to bank accounts, to energy, it applies to umpteen different things. At no stage has confusion marketing it also applies to supermarkets. I mean, the whole idea of, in supermarkets, typically 1/3 of the product is on special offer. Buy one, get one free, or whatever. And it doesn't last, of course, which is why one has so much shampoo in one's cupboard at home. All of this, of course, prevents any straightforward comparison of the price of a basket of goods, because the basket of goods includes any number of things which are being sold temporarily at ridiculously cheap prices, and the ridiculously cheap prices are A, financed by the suppliers, always financed by the suppliers in British supermarkets, and B, it's not the same things that are on special offer in Tesco and in Asda. So it really seemed to me that, and seemed to us, that we were really dealing with a very interesting example because, of course, you know, if you think of Scott's politics, the primary target is state socialist planning and imperialism. But here in the heart of empire, you have an experiment which is being conducted in exactly the same way, though whether one would call it high modernist, I don't know. And we've now reached the stage, of course, that the contradictions are piling up. So what people are doing is adding policy bolt-ons. So since 2008, broadly, under Mandelson and Cable, we've had industrial policy for rebalancing. And since last year, probably, we've also had HS2, HS3, Powerhouse of the North, regional policy through connecting the place up better, etc., etc. Now, I could go on and on about either connectivity or rebalancing, but the rebalancing is the one that I'm going to talk about, and it's very interesting because it's a profoundly conservative kind of policy. It's about recovering what's lost, and it's about embracing a kind of high-tech future which will be like Fordist manufacturing, only even better. And recovering what's lost is what people discovered after 2008, after the financial sector blew up, is that the tradable goods sector and manufacturing had collapsed in all high-income countries. That shows you the share of UK GDP and the share of UK employment in manufacturing. As you can see, in 1978, we had about 27% of the workforce in manufacturing. In 2010, it's down to 8%. We've lost 4 million jobs in manufacturing. You know, in a sense, at the end of the process, having laid the whole thing waste, rebalancing is about saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could get some of this stuff back? And I think the problem, of course, is that by the time you've run it down to this level, the leverage that you have through revitalizing manufacturing is very limited indeed. Manufacturing productivity, labor productivity, typically increases by 3% per annum. So you've got to start sustained increases you need sustained increases in output simply to stabilize manufacturing employment. To double or treble manufacturing employment, you would actually be looking at something which is not practically attainable. After all, British manufacturing is a sector whose real value of output is now roughly the same as it was in the mid-1970s. It hasn't achieved any increase in output. And then there's all this stuff which is also tied in with rebalancing. It's not only recovering what's lost, but it's high-tech sectors, biotech, pharma, cultural industries, prestige, manufacturing, all, of course, you know, with a delightful set of characteristics, high wage, high productivity, knowledge-intensive activities, only hang on with the kind of clapped-out British manufacturing that we've got. The largest manufacturing sector, employing 400,000 people, is food manufacturing. The sausage manufacturers, the people who are putting milk into plastic bottles, are the largest manufacturers in the UK. So, you know, what we've had is an experiment in kind of applying competition of markets as a generic recipe to mundane activities, which hasn't worked. And policymakers, as you can see from the response to the banking competition authority inquiry last week, have not come to terms with this and are just adding these kinds of fantasy bolt-ons. I could also talk about connectivity in the north of England, where, of course, I think the central mistake is that if you add connectivity in a rich city like London, then it actually will work to increase prosperity. But if you connect Liverpool and Manchester in a train in half the time at a higher fare, it does very little indeed. We'll carry on developing that argument another time. But let me now come to the foundational economy. Because at one level, if you actually follow through the argument, it makes you weep. We have a national experiment which hasn't halted decline. And we have pervasive mismanagement in a whole series of everyday sectors. And you actually reach the point where you actually go into the supermarket and you see the sausages are on special offer. And you realize the special offer is at the expense of the processor. And you realize this is not going well. So how do you get some kind of way out of this impasse? Well, one of the things we started thinking about was the foundational economy, which is several different things. To start off with, it's what's left. If you go to Pittsburgh or Walloon, Belgium, or Llanelli, South Wales, which is where I come from. The tradable goods sector has completely collapsed. When I was a kid in the town I was brought up, I worked in tin plate for a while, and we exported tin plate all over the world. And we did car components, and we did specialist steel, and we had a foundry, and we had a tin stamping works which made enamel saucepans and all the rest of that. All of that is gone now, except for about a couple of hundred people working on car components and 400 people in a shed still making tin plate. And what you have left when all the tradable goods sector is left, it's quite interesting. You've got two things. You've got a large-scale organization of branches and networks around things like education and supermarkets. You've still got primary and secondary education in supermarkets in places where tradable goods have collapsed. Each of them usually employs around 4% of the local workforce. And then you've also got small and micro firms which can survive in hard times. 1/3 of Welsh employment is currently in micro firms employing less than 10, and the average micro firm last year employed 1.7, including the proprietor, and had turnover of £47,000. This is the small farmer, the cafe owner, the carpenter and the mate with a clapped-out second-hand van. This kind of thing represents resilience and adaptation when other opportunities are closed. And it's, of course, a story that's familiar to all anthropologists. So one could think of the foundational, first of all, as when tradable goods have collapsed, it's what you've got left. But then, rather excitedly, we realized that you could think about it as an intellectual object, if you like, because you could bracket these activities and get an intellectual and a political object of intervention by saying, look, all the things we're interested in the mundane are necessary to everyday life. They're consumed by citizens regardless of income or status. They're distributed according to population through branches and networks, and typically they're little local monopolies which are sheltered and franchised. You probably don't think of a supermarket as a local monopoly. But if you actually think, before they started moving back into the towns, at the superstores they built, they're all covered by planning regulations which prevent somebody actually building a new superstore on a roundabout adjacent to one which already exists. So in effect, when you get planning permission for a superstore, you get a franchise to take money from households in a kind of 4-mile radius forever and a day. And so when thought of the activities that meet these criteria, pipe and cable utilities, transport, much of retail, food production and processing, and health, education, and welfare. And it's really quite interesting if you look at this and you remember that manufacturing now implies just 8%, and that, after all, is the object of official industrial policy at the Department of BIS, etc. If you start thinking about the foundational economy, it actually implies very large numbers indeed. Here's some figures on England, and you can see the private sector, the privatized utilities, the supermarkets, the food processing, typically employs about 10% of the workforce. And then the state employed, or the state subvented, like nursery education in the UK, actually employs 25% or more of the workforce. If you actually look at these mundane activities, nobody is very interested in them, but nevertheless, they're hugely important as large-scale employers in the UK, right across the UK. If you actually look at successful economic areas, you'll actually find well over 30% of the workforce employed in these activities, because it's distributed according to population. And then the The other thing that makes it interesting is that in many ways, these mundane activities are the first lien on household income, both through expenditure, the weekly shop at the supermarket, and all the rest of that, and through taxes. Around 30% of the average household's consumption expenditure goes on the basic things in the foundational economy, and that's to exclude taxes and all the rest of that, which pay for your education and your health, which is, of course, free at the point of use. And the third thing that makes these interesting is that if you actually start to think about these things, then, you know, clean water, reliable energy supplies, reasonable quality food, healthcare are actually key determinants of welfare. So this stuff is actually not simply what survives in deindustrialized areas, it's actually very important quantitatively and strategically in any account of an economy. And why haven't we noticed it before? Well, various people have noticed it before, but they just weren't social scientists. Because, again, I think one of the things, a bit like realizing that, you know, it's Tim Mitchell and James C. Scott all over again, one of the things as an ex-historian, I would say, is one suddenly began to realize that this was Braudel all over again. We have, and this has been powerfully reinforced by national income accounting, being sold the idea that there is one economy, a singular economy. And national income accounting, of course, says you can add and subtract everything within that economy. And if you actually look at the right-wing political message, you know, that is the zone in which we must live and compete. And I've got a quote there from Boris Johnson in his Thatcher lecture last year saying, like it or not, the free market economy is the only show in town. Britain is competing in an increasingly impatient and globalized economy in which the competition is getting ever stiffer. That's the way that people have tried to get us to think about the economy, the singular economy, the one zone, the need for competition. But in fact, if you go back to Braudel, you actually see, and this overlaps with Wallerstein too, I think, you actually see a notion of a multi-zone economy, material life, market exchange, high capitalism. And there's lots more in Braudel, incidentally, particularly about how capitalism is really, and Wallerstein takes this over too, I think, the idea capitalism is much more about monopoly than it is about competition. And, you know, in a sense, and quite cheerfully, I think you can knock off a fair amount of Braudel and say there's a foundational zone in the economy, there's a competitive zone in which Jaguar Land Rover exports cars against the Germans, and then there's a supra-economy of long-chain finance which runs out of Canary Wharf. And these are all have different logics, different requirements, etc., in a way that was celebrated by Braudel but is denied. So at another level, we have the foundational economy as what's left. We've got the foundational economy turned into an intellectual object. We've got the foundational economy with intellectual precursors. And finally, the foundational economy is obviously simply a reinvention of Beveridge. Because if you actually look at William Beveridge and the liberal collectivists, they were about intervention to secure the material basics for the whole population, which was defined in 1944 in terms of the abolition of want, the elimination of material poverty measured by Rowntrie's subsistence minima. And the really interesting thing, of course, here is at this point you can say, well, with the foundational, if you start to say that foundational goods and services are what is the basis of material life and civilized existence, which I think William Beveridge would agree with if he were with us today. You see Beveridge's ends have been reinvented, but you also see that Beveridge's means are no longer adequate. Beveridge believed essentially in redistribution through the technology of social insurance. And what you were going to do was essentially have a workforce of well-paid, full-time male workers who, through their contributions on a pay-as-you-go basis, covered the income needs of the sick, the unemployed, and retired, and covered the needs of women, courtesy of a kind of biblical household structure and all the rest of that. We could actually go into that in course. But the basic idea is that you've got a core workforce which is full-time and well-paid, and you simply take a little off those each week to cover the costs of ensuring that nobody who's unemployed or old is in poverty. What we've done in the UK in the last 30 years is a very peculiar experiment, because people always say, well, you know, Thatcher was such a brave woman. I never believed that at all. There's huge amounts of compromise built into the British experiment, particularly with the inflation of spending on health and education so as to actually generate middle-class jobs. But the contradiction, of course, is that flexibilization of the labor market meant an experiment in combining American-style labor markets with low pay and combining that with European-style social protection, which means if you get low pay, you can claim some benefit from the state to make up your income or whatever. Housing benefit, free childcare, or whatever. And as the experiment has matured, so you've had ever more low-paid households demanding ever more subvention of wages. And here is the killer exhibit of the afternoon, which is a graph which shows you, this is still from work in progress, non-retired households, working households, receiving more in benefits than taxes paid. These are households which are in work and receive more in benefits than in taxes paid. Now, it's not been published because it's still the subject of argument, and the argument is partly about how you value benefits in kind, which is a very large issue indeed. My argument is we should publish it, because provided you make a consistent estimate of benefits in kind, you know, the line could be put higher or lower, but it wouldn't affect the trend. But what you see is when Thatcher comes along, 27.6% of non-retired households are actually receiving more in benefits than taxes paid. And by the time Labour leaves, it's nearly 40% of households. 40% of working households receiving more in benefits than in taxes paid. It's completely unsustainable. And of course, the only way you can deal with that is through the heroism of Osborne, which is to cut benefits, not raise taxes. Obviously, what they have to do is simply reduce the level of benefits, as, of course, low pay continues to spread through the economy. And that's why, in one slide, is why redistribution is not going to work in the UK. And so we've got an interesting focus on mundane activities. And we can turn it into an intellectual object, thread them together, because they all provide necessary things distributed according to population in little local monopolies. And we can invoke Braudel and Beveridge. But at the end with Beveridge, we're left with this problem of if the Beveridgean solution doesn't work, and if the post-79 experiment is about, to sort of come apart slowly and unpleasantly on its internal contradictions, what should you actually do? And at this point, we take a deep breath and suggest that the task might be reorganizing mismanaged sectors rather than redistributing income. And as soon as you start talking about reorganization, I think you do actually need to have some notion of what you're trying to get at. And I think at this point, where one would wish to go actually overlaps with the circular economy, the green economy, and a number of other things. This is not a unique kind of perception. But I think the way I would put it is what we're concerned with is grounded localities. Grounded localities. And I think, I do like the idea of the grounded because it seems to me, what's wrong with the authoritarian experiment is that it is in some sense ungrounded, just like the Soviet collectivization of agriculture. And grounded localities re-territorializing, in a sense, with more foundational goods from changed firm and public sector behaviors. More foundational goods, because if you actually think about what economic success is, jobs and growth doesn't mean economic success, because jobs increasingly means low-paid jobs requiring state subvention, and growth only goes to the people at the top end of the income distribution. Piketty has made a fortune out of that observation, and good luck to him. So jobs and growth aren't measures of success. So what is the measure of success? Well, I would say one important measure of success is reasonably adequate and reasonably priced supplies of the key foundational goods. If you think of what households worry about in South African townships or Manchester, it's housing, utility services, food, health and social care, education, which are the basis of material security and civilized life. And the interesting thing is that if you actually look at it that way, of course, it's a bit like Tolstoy's Unhappy Family. The household in Enfield and the household in Soweto are both unhappy, but in different ways. In Soweto, it's likely to be about utility connections and complicated problems which relate to not paying for electricity, and Eskom's deals with the coal companies and all the rest of that kind of business. In London, it's likely to be housing, housing, housing. And I think it's quite interesting to see that you can shift the measures of success, and then you'd say, well, at each level locally, you need to conduct some kind of inventory of what the deficiencies are. And then I think on the supply side, you've also got it, which is you need to shift from point value. Remember the trader mentality of it's my revenue account, and I'm going to get the least cost or the best price. And what you should do is go for chain obligation and social payback. And if you actually think of foundational firms and public sector organizations, then they are actually exceptions to the kinds of firm that people like Johnson, the Mayor of London, imagines, which are mobile firms. Because a supermarket needs to run a national chain so that it can actually tap household demand all over the place. Ditto with the banks. If they're actually got little local monopolies on household demand, isn't it time we asked and what in return are you putting into the community? And so, I mean, at present we're working, well, I am Welsh, and this is quite an important thing for me, but we also happen to be working on Wales at present. And, you know, in Wales, for example, you would start by asking all the supermarket chains to buy Welsh lamb and dairy at prices which sustain farmers and processors. This is, of course, this isn't rocket science, but I think if you start to think about it in these terms, you can start to think systematically about what kinds of demands you would make of capitalist enterprises and public sector organizations. You know, I give you one example, which is, to my knowledge in Wales, only Carmarthen County Council has actually gone so far as, in building contracts, to buy the materials so that, in fact, it can put out labor-only contracts to the two guys with a second-hand van. Because, of course, if you're two guys in a second-hand van, you don't have the bank credit to buy £35,000 worth of materials. It's just very simple thinking about how would you actually, you know, break up the contract so that the really small guys can bid. And you can think this one through at every level, including, above all, at universities. There is fuss in this country about the procurement policies of local councils, but not about universities and hospitals. And so let me give you a series of visionary demands. The first, I think, is what we'd call social licensing. And basically, that means larger foundational employers, like supermarkets, banks, universities, and hospitals, should be clearly put under some obligation to put back socially something in return for what they take out economically. This is quite explicitly, this is all bricolage. It's borrowed from what indigenous peoples would try to impose on mining companies, which is, if you want to take the iron ore out of the mountain, what are you going to do for us in return? And I think you change private and public sector contracts, and it's basically, a lot of it is about chain thinking, procurement thinking, and thinking about procurement so you create opportunities for local labor, for local firms, and you think about the implications of what you're doing. For example, if you don't pay living wages, then essentially in another account, the state is making up those wages in a way that threatens your and my free health services in due course. And I think this also has an implication, a sober recognition. This is not triumphalist stuff, which is social responsibility of this kind has a cost. And the result would be that many firms would earn lower profits, and that we would need to think about how we financed those firms. And there's actually a very good example of this in Welsh Water or Dŵr Cymru, which is the only water company which is bond financed, which means nowadays you'd pay 5 to 7%. Whereas if you're actually looking at a shareholder value company, you want 10% return on equity. It's possible to financially engineer a world where firms accept lower returns, but you've got to basically think about social licensing, because there's a limit to the social responsibility that people will do voluntarily. And then think through, if it has costs in terms of profits, what you do about it. Here's a second thing. Reinvent taxation. Largest amount of foundational employment in any economy you look at is publicly funded out of taxation. And I think there are two key moves, which is, one, I think, you do need to basically end the waste of broad-based business-friendly concessions. The whole idea that you make corporation tax voluntary and you pay all firms, and only some of them are probably going to do what they're going to do in any case. I think the idea of simply reducing tax rates, making corporation tax voluntary. If you look historically in the UK, the yield of corporation tax as a percentage of total tax has fallen dramatically. And we also, of course, have all these concessions which allow debt-financed private equity to escape taxation. I think you really need to stop broad-based business-friendly concessions. And then secondly, you need to reinvent the social technologies of taxation. One of the really shameful things about the UK is that we invented PAYE, pay-as-you-earn, in the 1940s, which allowed the state for the first time to tax workers who are on weekly incomes. Previously, income tax had been a strictly middle-class tax because it was reserved for those who could settle a bill at the end of the year, which was not the world in which the working class lived. Now, PAYE, which I mean, to my knowledge, the history of PAYE has never been hidden. It's an absolutely heroic invention on par, you know, with social insurance as a way of tapping mass incomes so that you get a substantial tax base. And the obvious thing that you need to do in the UK is some form of land value tax. There's an unearned increment on houses and property from urban development. You build Crossrail, there's a huge boost in property values close. We don't tax it at all. You know, and it's not beyond the wit of man to reinvent the social technologies of taxation. It may be beyond practical politics quickly, but that would certainly be an objective. And here, the sobriety too comes in. Remember, the sobriety on the last slide was more social responsibility equals lower profits, and you're going to have finance firms on that basis. The sobriety here is many of the problems of foundational supply are being solved at present by loading expense and liabilities onto the state. You say public-private partnerships, PFI, the state building of hospitals and schools on expensive, poor-value mortgages, in effect. The state underwriting of utility returns, which is required before utilities will invest, the subvention of inadequate wages, etc. You know, the general solution to all problems of contradiction is to say, well, we'll load the liabilities onto the state. You cannot proceed in that way, even if you have reinvented taxation. And here's the third visionary demand. The first visionary demand was social licensing. The second visionary demand was the reinvention of social taxation. The third one was to press for social innovation. If you Google innovation, you'll quickly come up with the economists and people like Mariano Mazzucato at Sussex, whose idea of innovation is technical, to raise productivity, to produce growth and jobs, essentially. None of that stuff, incidentally, while people like Mariana, I think, and her colleagues produce very good critiques of financialized capitalism, none of them come to terms with how only a small part of the income comes to the lower income groups, etc., etc. But anyway, technical innovation produces increases in productivity and income, which are largely appropriated by the upper income groups. What we need is social innovation to meet unsolved foundational needs, and those would be different in different localities. If you move, for example, from deindustrial South Wales to rural Mid Wales, then housing is not a problem in rural Mid Wales, but fast broadband and transport is a problem. So there's local deficiencies which need social innovation. And there's also, I think, it's not all local problems, because there are some very large issues which our society and many other societies deal with very badly. And the one that particularly concerns me is adult care. In the UK at present, we have 3 million people over the age of 80. That's projected to increase to 8 million over the next 30 years or so. And adult care already employs 5% of the UK workforce. Almost nobody talks about adult care in the UK unless they have an elderly relative who immediately needs some kind of care. But it's actually very interesting indeed. And there's, I'm sorry, these slides are partly taken out of Welsh presentations. 6.9% of the Welsh population works in adult care, looking after old people. You know, when we fought the miners' strike in 1985, it was about 2% of the Welsh workforce which was working down coal mines. It's kind of very interesting kind of thing about what's visible and what's not visible, what you defend, what you prioritize, etc., etc. You know, the 6.9% in Wales are invisible, whereas, you know, we went to the barricades for 2% of the workforce in the mining workforce in 1985. And I think this involves two things. I mean, it seems to me we need to have not simply inventories of local deficiencies, broadband, housing, or whatever it might be, and variably, but we need to have a debate about unsolved social problems and new priorities. For example, are we agreed that one of the tests of a civilized society is how we care for the elderly? You know, I mean, it seems to me the whole series of things which indicate, you know, whether we're serious about civilization. The two ones that I always give as the example are A, the quality of school meals, which is absolute crap in the UK, and B, the quality of adult care, which is also generally of too often of low quality and increasingly unaffordable for local councils with the expenditure cuts that are being forced through. And I think, you know, you can only actually do something about this if you have some kind of debate about what constitutes a civilized society. And it's quite interesting that on the school wheels one, courtesy of Jamie Oliver, we're a little further ahead than we are on adult social care. And I think that's really humiliating if we think of ourselves as a society. And the second thing is we need to think about how we empower the public and the third sectors to take a leading role. And the reason for this is not that I have any general prejudice against private operators, but at present we have financialized private chains in adult care who are basically sweating the workforce through pay cuts, and their innovation is primarily not in care, but it's directed towards financial innovation to reduce tax payments. The standard arrangement is propco-opco, whereby you put the property into one company and the operating company pays rent, etc., etc. That's all about financial innovation. There's almost no innovation at all if we think about how do we care for old people. Go into an adult care home. They're mainly now fairly modern bungaloid structures. They involve small rooms with no individual possessions in them at all. subject of critique in this year's Reith lectures. I'm really glad to see. But is this what you would like your parents to spend their final years in? Is it what I would like to spend my final years in? We need to think about social innovation, about what kind of accommodation we build for old people when they're frail and in need of help. So I think, you know, you can go so far with social licensing to enforce responsibility. You can go so far with reinventing tax technology, but you also need to innovate socially on major problems and issues. And the final point, because these were visionary demands, and maybe you're getting a little excited about all of this, is the severe political limits under which we currently operate. You know, all this stuff about grounded localities, re-territorialisation, isn't practical politics with the lot that we have in Westminster at present. And I think if you want to think about this, the most useful way is Colin Crouch's concept of post-democracy. We have a political system which, you know, the formalities of elections and all the rest of that continue, but the mass parties are increasingly professional organizations divorced from anything outside their bubble, and the politics doesn't articulate any choice of alternatives. Now, at one level, the blockage in Westminster is not absolute, because the grounded locality is not an all-or-nothing monolithic project. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why we have in our research centre been working with Enfield Council in North London since 2011, and are now working a bit in South Wales. And if you think grounded, you can immediately start to do things. The simplest thing that Enfield did was they were insulating social housing using imported materials, out-of-town contractors, and East European labour. And they thought, why don't we actually get local contractors certificated to use local labour to install panels which are made in, or at least finally pressed, in a little plant down the road. And I think this kind of thing about how do you actually think about getting local benefits can be applied by one council, it can be applied by a regional government, it can be applied at a variety of different scales and contexts. You certainly don't need permission to start doing something new and different. But where you get the political leverage for large-scale change, I do not know. I think you can do good deeds in, you know, local councils or whatever. But I think really, my own view is you would have to persuade, at least in the UK, one regional government in Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland to undertake a large-scale experiment in this area. Before you actually got a lot of political traction. But anyway, that's, I suppose, the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for a wonderful seminar, but what a sorry state. So, questions. Who would like to start with a question? So think about a question whilst you're thinking about a question. So one of the major growth areas in the foundational economy is care.
Yes.
Care for the elderly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, if we're going to be, if the new normal is going to be 1% growth across Europe, and if we're going to have sluggish growth or, you know, 8% of manufacturing, and you showed 6.9% people employed in care in Wales. I mean,
yeah.
You know, so, you know, and care for the elderly isn't the only care aspect.
It's all the more imaginative studies suggest that most caring is off the market and is done within families and on neighbourhood networks. And indeed, one of the big questions is how you can bring that kind of quality of care to the formal processes. And there are, in fact, some quite interesting examples in North London of this, particularly because you get lots of different ethnic communities. The Cypriot communities are organized so they deliver care from within the community, with care workers of the right ethnicity who stay with the firm. There's a variety of ways we can think about it.
Yeah, but it's an interesting problem though, because how could we change the economy so that more of the care that we actually do in society is suitably rewarded? I mean,
yeah, well, this is the problem that was really left by national income accounting, that what's on the market and commodified matters, and that what's not on the market and isn't commodified doesn't matter. And that is an unsolved accounting and political problem.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Now, take the question here. You have to shout because those behind you can't hear.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a lot in the news, well, there's a lot on Facebook certainly about TTIP, and I can see that it's been a massive problem for what you're talking about. If you have large companies that can basically sue, if you were to try and bring in something like, for instance, we insist on you paying the living wage, they can sort of start claiming that there's going to be a massive loss of earnings as a result of that. And I can see that as a massive problem if this sort of legislation comes into the UK. And what are your thoughts?
Yes and no. TTIP is basically, the next stage of capitulation to large corporates, basically, in that it gives them all kinds of legal rights and privileges over the lobbying and the prior stages of the process. Yes, it's disastrous. But no, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things is that radicals and people who want to do something different have to adopt the same approach as would be standard in the City of London, where you don't ask, what do the regulations say, but you say, how do we do what we want to do by hiring lawyers to get round or accountants to get round the regulations? Absolutely routine way of thinking. And it's quite interesting that I know of one case in Wales where in fact this approach has actually been applied to the use of local labour and materials in the refurbishment of council house, giving my age away, social housing. And they have actually produced a national pack based on legal advice, which says how you should frame the contracts so that you can get away with it. And I think there's an awful lot of lazy excuse that, at every level, for example, many councils have procurement policies, ostensibly of a progressive sort, but in fact, it's always least cost when it comes to it. The formal and the actual. And very few people have this kind of mentality of, I know what I want to do, now let's find a way to do it.
Yeah, please. Shout.
A large percentage of the people who actually work in, well, especially the manufacturing companies are migrants, and I'm wondering what you think would actually happen if we assume that this sector would increase. What would that actually do with migration? Would then native British people start taking these jobs, or would the relations stay the same?
The manufacturing workforce, the extent of employment of migrants varies quite a lot between different sectors. It's very high in ill-paid work, in harvesting and food processing. If you go into most sausage factories in the UK, you'll see the notices are in Polish and in English above the line. As part of the free and easy, employers have been encouraged to actually import amenable labor without family obligations, which is, which is readily available and readily discarded. I think you really have to take a different approach and say, you do have some kind of responsibility to the local population. There's a very interesting example of this in Enfield, where they planned to build 50 acres of greenhouses. London, like many other European cities, had a glasshouse district on the edge of it. And Waltham Forest was, until the late 1950s, the largest glassed area in Western Europe. There's nothing left now. And Enfield wants to rebuild glasshouses using waste heat from an incinerator. And their prime objective in the 50 acres is to employ local labor. And if you actually look at the comparator, it's an operation called Thanet Earth on Medway, which has got bits of national publicity, all of it unfavorable, because that is basically a British packer, Dutch growers, putting up glasshouses with gang-mastered labor. And the thing is simply allows you to put a Union Jack on the box of tomatoes, but it's got, the technology is German, the capital's Dutch. I mean, what is this doing for the Medway? It seems to me it's a reasonable question. If people are not, I think if employers are not constrained in some way, they will always take the easy route.
Please.
Your solution to create sustainable price may not be a reasonable price for the local population. I mean, how do you take a balance between that? I mean, even if people are earning living wage, sustainable price is probably too high, non-reasonable for the bottom.
Yeah, I think this is a really big kind of upcoming problem, and it's the one which I have most thought about in a troubled way when I talk with Green friends in Manchester, because they have basically what seems to me a kind of a mildly kind of Puritan approach to raising prices to a realistic level, to sustainable level. And it seems to me that when this comes at the end of a process of lowering wages and standards of living, this is not a politically saleable proposition in the UK. Do you understand? I mean, to simply say, we need to charge higher sustainable prices will produce a huge political reaction with people wanting, everything from, T-shirts for £2.50 and all the rest of that. My own view is that this is one of the advantages of a foundational economy way of thinking, at least as a way of supplementing other ways of thinking, because I think the pitch really has to be not in terms of sustainable pricing or whatever, but the pitch has to be in terms of material insecurity. What about your health service? What about the care of your parents? What about all these everyday things? I think that is very powerful. And interestingly, of course, it was the driving force behind the post-war settlement. Why was that so popular after 1945 in the UK? Because, people actually think, old age pensions, free health care, properly organized national education are good things. And I think there is, in an increasingly insecure society, there could be a political majority for that kind of public provision. In a way, I think there won't be a political majority for saying that the prices of the T-shirt or the box of tomatoes should be much higher to reflect all the costs. At that point, people will say, damn it, you know, I'm on low wages and I want the cheapest, you know, the cheapest goods in the world. I mean, I think that will be the response.
Sure, but because I see the irony of migration or migrant workers, migrant labor is really the sustainable price. Because if you have, let's say, not permanent migrants, but temporary migrants who would think about their earnings, assess it against their local price in home country, right? So that even if their wage is very low, British standard, it's high enough for their local economy.
Sure.
So this is probably the reason why migrants always come to the UK to work for the lower wage, and somehow it provides reasonable price for the local population.
Well, we import our cars. We're trying to import our labor as well. Yes.
Before we could actually get to a scenario like the one you've been describing.
That's very interesting because I think everybody agrees that the kind of delegative kind of democracy that we have is broken. Post-democracy, all the rest of that. The question of what you would put in its place is really very interesting indeed. And there's actually surprisingly little, again, a bit like adult care, there's surprisingly little discussion of this. I mean, Calon's written a kind of exceedingly abstract and quite interesting book, you know, about this kind of hybrid democracy, which is really about, you know, kind of how you use the expert in relation to the community. I think that about things like nuclear waste disposal and all the rest of that. But this doesn't begin to tackle the question of how you constitute new centers of expertise and who pays for them. Because I had this discussion, because it was John Law who made me read that book, and I had this discussion with John, and it seemed to me, you know, it kind of presupposed that there were experts in nuclear waste, so to speak, and they were on somebody's payroll in a university or in a nuclear energy company or whatever. And somehow or other, it was simply a question of bringing things together in an appropriate kind of way. But I've been quite interested since about how this doesn't seem to run into the areas of economics, for example. And I mean, we have, in Manchester, we have a group called the Post-Crash Economics Students, who are very smart indeed. And one of their proposals is for public interest economists. You know, there would be someone, you know, like Henrietta or whatever, whom you could ring up who would work on a kind of pro bono basis. And it sounds like a magic idea until one starts to think, well, we can't even afford legal aid in our society. You know, the idea of economists' aid is very difficult indeed. But somehow or other, I think, central to the idea is, central to all these problems are that to turn formal into substantive freedom, you have to have some kind of informed debate and mobilization of expertise. You know, start with Calon, that's where I would. I don't have the answer.
Following on from that, it's how do you spread the word? It feels to me that the only way you can spread the word now is to get people like Russell Brand to stand up and talk a load of nonsense and people pay attention, to actually engage the public, to think about these debates is a tricky step as well. So it's been great to come hear you talk this. I've got a lot of friends who feel very strongly about this, and there's very few places they can go to kind of express what they'd like. And you say that political parties don't embrace any of this. So how is this kind of?
Well, I can explain my own political strategy, which, you know, our group's political strategy, which is we search out losers. So basically you start by saying, look, you're fucked. You're utterly fucked. It's not going to work. And then you say, well, have you thought of doing something different? And like, for example, Scotland's a much tougher nut to crack than Wales in some senses. Wales has particular problems of its political culture, one-party state, etc. But I've certainly found in Enfield and in Wales that there are constituencies of people now who realize that standard policies aren't going to do anything for their community or region. And there also are, very interestingly, people who are outraged by that. Typically people who've got some kind of connection with the area going back for a long period of time. And not the mobile middle class, but people, who've been brought up in a place and can think about how it's developed over 20 or 30 years. And I think these people are a good audience. Most of them probably would not spend a lot of time reading Russell Brand. But I think they're a good audience because it is a society in a sense of distributed intelligence and serious people. And maybe also, and I was talking about this with Henrietta, our whole model really is, because of the two 30-year experiments, is that the centre is going to save us. It was the centre that delivered Beveridge, the welfare state, etc. It was the centre that delivered Thatcher and Blair and sold the council houses. We almost certainly need a world of experiments, a world of diversity, a world of plurality. In the last book, the end of the experiment book, some of the strongest bits are the bits that John Law wrote, which really come out of his kind of epistemology and ontology, but as it happens, do fit the present circumstances. Because I think, my line would be that if it was 1945, I'd vote Labour for Bevan and Bevin and, we'll have the welfare state. But where we are now, probably best to think of decentralized experiments and some kind of learning. What's so frightening about the centralized experiment is that there's no learning at all. And I think that things that really interest me is I punted lots of products out into the world, and telling people that, Richard Branson is a charlatan and train operating companies are profiteering, gratifies the world. They fall upon you because you've given them exactly what they want to hear. But if you tell them, look, we've been applying a generic model of competition in markets to a whole series of mundane sectors in a completely inappropriate kind of way, it puzzles a lot of people. And I think that again comes back to this point about grounded local people in loser localities, improvising, trying to figure out what you would do next if it's not going to look after you.
So one more question at the back then also. Yes, please.
Yeah, the point about experimentation resonates as well. I just happened to interview somebody today, an entrepreneur, just about to launch a new service called Netivist, which tries to pull together an aggregate debate, and also to help us conduct petitions and so forth. And the argument of this entrepreneur, who's a social scientist, in fact, working with friends, is that actually we're very far from meeting the potential of the internet when it comes to mobilizing citizens and so forth. So I guess it's more of a comment, not really a question, but I guess whether, I'd like to ask whether you agree the internet still has some potential in this direction.
Well, I'm sure, you know, the internet is like the internal combustion engine, atomic power, and a number of other things. You know, it obviously has huge potential. And like all technologies, it can be used in a huge variety of different ways. I do not think, if you look at the kind of social innovation problems that I was talking about, that there is some kind of technical fix for problems of that sort. Because, as Henrietta was implying, you know, in a sense, it's about how we value care, what we assign values to, and all the rest of that. Because technology is not going to solve that kind of problem. That is, it's a kind of deliberative kind of problem. And I think we would need technology and expertise to assist us. I mean, I think, you know, you can't think about adult care sensibly unless you realize that, think of what's being spent locally and then multiply that by three times over the next 20 years. And, you know, that's the scale of the crisis that faces us. But I think, you know, if you put it together bits of it, you can. And, you know, I wouldn't kind of disrespect the green agenda or any of the other sort of visions, so to speak. But I do think that if you bring it down to something like, how do we care for the elderly? What about your parents? What about me in 15 years' time? You know, all the rest of that, it does give you some kind of traction.
Good. That seems like a very good place to stop. So thank you, Karel, so much for a wonderful, wonderful lecture or seminar, and for coming all the way from Manchester to this locality. We much appreciated your rounded efforts here. So you join me in thanking Professor